You're listening to the Midnight Library of Baseball, where there's no loud music, no jarring sounds, only nostalgic, thought-provoking, emotional stories about baseball. I'm Ben Orlando. Like many things with Judge Kenesaw Mountain Landis, his stance on race and segregation is complicated. And the more I looked into it, the more I wondered, what the heck is going on? When Landis was being criticized for holding the judgeship when he became commissioner, a black newspaper, the Chicago Advocate, wrote an editorial supporting him. Quote, "The Chicago Advocate, speaking for the entire race, wishes to extend to Judge Landis their appreciation for his fair and impartial justice. We, the Negroes of this portion of the country, are thoroughly satisfied with the decisions of Judge Landis and have no fault whatever to find with them." End quote. And the third largest African American newspaper in the country, the Baltimore Afro American, wrote this when Landis became commissioner. Quote, "Landis is eminently fair, and if it were left to him, there would be colored Major League Baseball clubs tomorrow." End quote. Clearly, they were wrong. But because of Landis's track record, they believed he was a man who would work hard to bring equality to the game, and that he would continue to work hard not only for Black Americans, but Black ball players. But a key phrase in this quote from the Afro American was, "if it were left up to him." In this, Landis would have wholeheartedly agreed that it was not up to him. Along these same lines, Landis biographer David Pietrusa argued that, hey, wait a second, we have to look at Landis through the lens of his own time. Quote, "Landis certainly bears some responsibility for baseball segregation. However, to imply that it was he and he alone who created or prolonged the situation whitewashes the attitudes and action of much, if not most, of baseball's establishment." End quote. And not just baseball's establishment. Racism was an enormous issue throughout the country, and it went all the way to the top. President at the time, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the black federal employees he did not fire, and he publicly praised D.W. Griffith's The Birth of the Nation. And just as a reminder, Birth of a Nation portrays African Americans as violent and corrupt, and it portrays the Ku Klux Klan, men in white robes and white pointed masks, as heroic saviors who bring peace and order. This was the state of America in the 1920s. We can see some of the first racial issues popping up for the commissioner with the practice of barnstorming, which is where major league players played exhibition games against other professional but not major league teams during the offseason. They did this for fun, to stay sharp, but also to make money, considering that major leaguers at the time didn't make a lot of money. Remember, well into the 1960s and 70s, major league players took second jobs to support their families. Barnstorming was an important source of income for everyone involved. There were various factors that led to owners and the commissioner in trying to crack down on barnstorming. One, major league players could injure themselves. Two, they were making money that wasn't going to the owners in Major League Baseball. And three, the most significant reason, was racism. During the 1920s, Rube Foster, who had been a player, then manager, then executive in the Negro Leagues, met with Landis after Landis canceled one of Foster's exhibition games. Foster said to Landis, "This is how we make our money. Why would you cancel this game?" To which Landis replied, quote, When you beat our teams, it gives us a black eye. End quote. Now, you could take this comment a number of ways, but overall, Landis is saying our major league players are elite, top of the top. So when non major league clubs beat those elite players, it calls into question their elite status. It knocks them down a peg. But every time Landis says something like this or thinks it, he's choosing to lower major league players instead of elevating barnstorming teams, including Negro League players. It's such a simple switch. Imagine if he would have seen things simply as they were. He would have said, our major league boys are getting beaten consistently by black ball clubs. So it stands to reason that those black players are just as good, or sometimes better, than major league players. Instead, right to Rube Foster's face, he says, your team's beating us gives us a black eye. I wonder if I were to go back in time and ask Landis, how can you say they're not as good if they keep beating ball clubs composed of major league players? How would he have responded? The typical response by baseball at the time was, well, it was a fluke, or the major leaguers weren't really trying because it wasn't a real major league game. According to Pietrusa, it's alleged that in 1922, Landis forbade major league teams from playing as entire units after the all black Philadelphia Hilldales swept the St. Louis Browns in a 3-game series. And in 1925, after the all black Chicago American Giants beat the Babe Ruth All Stars in 6 out of 7 games, Landis stepped in and cut down the number of future contests between the two teams. The big showdown with Landis and barnstorming came in 1921 when Landis faced off with the other larger than life figure in baseball, Babe Ruth. Ruth was steamed when he learned that after the 1921 World Series, he wouldn't be able to barnstorm. This had in fact been a major league rule since 1911 that any player playing in the World Series couldn't compete afterward in exhibition games in the offseason. But prior to this time, they were fined $100 or less. During the last game of the 1921 season, Landis visited the Yankees locker room, where Ruth asked him, quote, Judge, what's all this talk about our being forbidden to barnstorm after the series? End quote. Landis told him it was the rule and it would be enforced. To which a still very young Babe Ruth replied, quote, well, I'm notifying you that I am going to violate the rule, and I don't care what you do about it. End quote. Thus began the Clash of the Titans. Babe Ruth and some of his teammates started their barnstorming tour after the season, and Landis vocally condemned them, repeating his threats about rules and penalties. Back and forth the two men went, threatening, retaliating. At one point, Ruth said the commissioner should go jump in a lake, which I imagine for 1921 was equivalent to go F yourself. Landis pulled strings to shut down or drive off the crowds, so Ruth was seeing smaller and smaller turnouts for his exhibition games. Meanwhile, the public, who adored Babe Ruth, ultimately sided with Judge Landis. A rule was a rule. In this great showdown, which really set a precedent, Landis won. Landis suspended Ruth and teammates Bob Musial and Bill Piercy for the first month of the 1922 season. This was huge, and you can see the sting in Babe Ruth's stats. In the previous 2 seasons, Ruth hit 54 home runs and 59 home runs, along with 135 RBIs and 168 RBIs. But in 1922, Ruth hit a meager 35 home runs with 96 RBIs. And I know anyone listening probably saying, a meager 35 home runs and 96 RBIs? Most players in baseball would kill for those numbers, but this was Babe Ruth. Over the course of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, Landis continued to restrict or ban exhibition games. In 1942, the Kansas City Monarchs, led by famed Negro League pitcher Satchel Paige, beat the Dizzy Dean All-Stars 3-1, drawing a crowd of 29,000 at Wrigley Field, which was huge at the time. Satchel Paige and his teammates continued to beat Dizzy Dean and his major league players in different cities throughout the season, including a defeat in Pittsburgh on June 5th that brought the largest crowd to Forbes Field of the season. What was Landis's reaction? To ban the next meeting of the two teams on July 4th. When asked why, Landis said simply, "These games were outdrawing major league games." In 1938, two managing editors from the largest black newspaper in the world, the Pittsburgh Courier, met with Landis to discuss the topic of integration, to which Landis responded that the time wasn't right for blacks in baseball. You can, of course, find this argument throughout history, especially from politicians. Something like, yes, yes, we know it's the right thing to do, but the people aren't ready. The people don't want it. And Landis wasn't wrong that there was a ton of animosity in the 1920s and 30s, not just whites toward the black community, but of whites toward other minorities and whites toward other whites, like Jews, Irish, and Italians. There was a lot of fear out there, a lot of anger, and this fear and anger sometimes led to violent conflicts. Part of Landis's hesitance was that he didn't want riots occurring in the ballpark. And to be sure, he'd lived through a history of violence and race riots throughout the previous 30 years. One event in 1938 highlighted this animosity and the divide between communities. And for anyone listening now with children, there's some language coming up in the next 30 seconds you might feel is inappropriate for children. In 1938, Yankees outfielder Jake Powell sat for an interview with White Sox announcer Bob Elson. Offhandedly, Elson asked Powell what he did during the offseason. When he asked the question, Elson was expecting a casual, innocent reply. Instead, Jake Powell answered, quote, "I'm a cop in Southern Illinois, and I get a lot of pleasure beating up niggers and throwing them in jail." End quote. Bob Elson was shocked. He sat there stunned for a moment and then ended the interview. What made this exchange even more surprising was that the conversation was being aired live to tens of thousands of listeners. In his biography, David Pietrusa writes that immediately following the interview, Chicago's black community was rightfully incensed and bombarded Landis's office with protests and demands for action. And Landis did speak out and suspended Powell for 10 days. On one hand, you might say Landis often didn't stick his head out of his office to say anything. And here he not only said something, he punished Powell. On the other hand, you might say only 10 games for publicly stating that you beat up black people for pleasure? So there is this debate, and the black community was incensed. But what about the rest of the community? Dick Crepeau, who you may remember from my Eddie Sissons episode, wrote an article on the Jake Powell incident. And as to the white community, Crepeau wrote, quote, "To a remarkable degree, the development of this story beyond initial reporting of the incident was ignored by the white press. Only when Powell returned to the Yankees lineup to be greeted by a bottle shower did the white press take note." End quote. So again, Landis has this argument: the country's not ready. I mean, look, he could say, the majority of news outlets didn't care to raise a stink about it. So what do you want me to do? But to Landis and other politicians, the question then is, how long do you wait? How long do you wait for people to become fair-minded and kind? There's a recent commencement speech by Governor J.B. Pritzker, delivered at Northwestern University, that I think is relevant here. I'm going to read part of it now. Quote, "The best way to spot an idiot? Look for the person who is cruel. Let me explain. When we see someone who doesn't look like us, or sound like us, or act like us, or love like us, or live like us, the first thought that crosses almost everyone's brain is rooted in either fear or judgment, or both. That's evolution. We survived as a species by being suspicious of things that we aren't familiar with. In order to be kind, we have to shut down that animal instinct and force our brain to travel a different pathway. Empathy and compassion are evolved states of being. They require the mental capacity to step past our most primal urges. Cruelty is seen by some as an adroit cudgel to gain power. Empathy and kindness are considered weak. I'm here to tell you that when someone's path through this world is marked with acts of cruelty, they have failed the first test of an advanced society. They never forced their animal brain to evolve past its first instinct. They never forged new mental pathways to overcome their own instinctual fears. And so their thinking and problem solving will lack the imagination and creativity that the kindest people have in spades. Over my many years in politics and business, I have found one thing be universally true. The kindest person in the room is often the smartest." End quote. When I just read this, I got emotional because here in this episode, I'm talking about events from 100 years ago, and yet this speech was delivered in 2023. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. There are so many people right now who cannot remember the past. Kenesaw Mountain Landis couldn't remember his past because he feared what would happen with interracial ball games, but they were happening all the time. And when we go back to Landis's past, we see that in 1925, in Wichita, Kansas, the Ku Klux Klan ball club played the Monrovians, an all-black team from the same area. According to writer Larry Lester, the Monrovians won the game, and there was no reported violence. And these kinds of meetings in local tournaments happen frequently, and they happened under the watchful eye of Kenesaw Mountain Landis, the most powerful man in baseball, and hence one of the most powerful men in the country. There's an article on Sabre by Larry Lester titled, "Can You Read, Judge Landis?" This title is taken from a movement in 1942 started by journalist Lester Rodney, who was for years outspoken on the need to end segregation in general and certainly in baseball. Unfortunately, for credibility's sake, Rodney wrote for the Daily Worker, a communist newspaper. Still, communism in the 1930s and early 40s wasn't what it would become in the US after World War II and the Cold War. Rodney and the Daily Worker started this campaign called "Can You Read, Judge Landis?" Journalists and major trade unions came together to draft, sign, and send petitions to Judge Landis calling for the end of segregation in baseball. And one of their main arguments was African Americans are joining the military, they're serving alongside white Americans, and they're dying together on the battlefield for their country. And you're saying they can't play a game together? The movement gathered more than 1 million signatures. They sent petition after petition to Landis's office. And all the while, the commissioner remained silent. The movement bombarded movie houses with pamphlets titled "In the Spirit of Lou Gehrig," based on statements Gehrig had made about integration. Gehrig said, quote, "I have seen and played against many Negro players who could easily be stars in the big leagues. I could name just a few of them like Satchel Paige, Buck Leonard, Josh Gibson, and Barney Brown, who should be in the majors. I'm all for it, 100%. End quote. And still, Landis said nothing. A few years earlier, journalist Wendell Smith reached out to 40 Major League ball players and managers to get their opinions on segregation. Most of the reactions were similar. From Pittsburgh Pirates president William Benswanger, quote, if the question of admitting colored baseball players into organized baseball becomes an issue, I would be heartily in favor of it, end quote. From Cubs manager Gabby Hartnett, quote, I saw two of the greatest ball players that ever lived, Rube Foster and Smokey Joe Williams. They were both pitchers, and although I was just a kid, I was convinced that they were certainly good enough for the majors, end quote. Busy Dean, who for years led barnstorming tours against black teams, said, quote, if some of the colored players I played against were given a chance to play in the majors, they'd be stars as soon as they joined up, end quote. Basically, there was no debate among major league players, managers, and owners that at least dozens of black or dark skinned players were good enough to play at the major league level. But because of racism and not wanting to change the establishment, they didn't want this truth to get out to the American people. But of course, the American people were heading out in droves to learn this very fact for themselves. In 1941, the Negro League's East West All Star game drew more than 50,000 fans, which is a huge number for that time and for today. In 1942, Landis was put in a tough spot when Dodgers manager Leo DeRocher said in an interview with the Daily Worker, quote, I'll play with the colored boys on my team if the big shots give the okay. Hell, I've seen a million good ones, end quote. Same interview, DeRocher also noted that in the quest to keep black players out of baseball, there was a, quote, grapevine understanding or subterranean rule at play, end quote. When Landis heard this, he was furious. He ordered DeRocher to his office. And just to get a picture here, Leo DeRocher was known as a hard-headed, in-your-face screamer. He was the stereotypical manager who'd stand in an umpire's face, arguing and spraying spit until he was ejected from the game. So here's this tough-as-nails manager walking into Landis's office. And when he walks out, he tells the press he was misquoted in that interview. He didn't say the things that were printed. And Landis, when he emerged, had this to say, quote, there is no rule against major league clubs hiring Negro baseball players. I have come to the conclusion it is time for me to explain myself on this important issue. Negroes are not barred from organized baseball by the commissioner and have never been since the 21 years I have served. There is no rule in organized baseball prohibiting their participation, to my knowledge. End quote. Landis went on to say, quote, if DeRocher or any other manager or all of them want to sign 1 or 25 Negro players, it is all right with me. That is the business of the manager and the club owners. End quote. So here you have the most powerful man in baseball putting his hands up, saying, if they wanted to, as in the owners, they absolutely could have integrated. And if they had done so, it would have been fine by me. Journalist Lester Rodney was inducted into the Baseball Reliquary Shrine of the Eternals for his work to end segregation in baseball. And this is what he had to say about Kenesaw Mountain Landis. Quote, if you ask any honest sports writer, he will tell you Landis was a racist. He was a cold man. He could at any time as commissioner have said, something is wrong with this game. End quote. Those who see Kenesaw Mountain Landis as the main obstacle to ending segregation point to Jackie Robinson signing with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1945, less than a year after Landis's death. But others, like Dan Busby and David Pietrusa, highlight the absence of a flood of signings after Landis's death. From Busby, quote, "Years after Jackie Robinson broke the major league color barrier in 1947, no one can contend that from his grave, Landis prevented the Philadelphia Athletics from featuring Bob Trice until 1953, or the New York Yankees from featuring Elston Howard until 1955, the Detroit Tigers from featuring Ozzie Virgil Sr. until 1958, and the Boston Red Sox from featuring Elijah Pumpsie Green until 1959. That responsibility squarely rested with each of the respective team owners." End quote. So even after Landis died, it took 15 years for every major league team to have a black player on its roster. There clearly was a widespread resistance to change. But as Lester Rodney said, Landis, as commissioner, at any time could have announced to the country, "Excuse me, everyone, listen, there is something terribly wrong with this game." Think of all the clout Landis had amassed in his 24 years as the final decision maker in Major League Baseball. If, in say 1930, Landis held a press conference and said, "Something is really wrong with baseball," if he talked about the reality that black players and Mexican players and Cuban players were as good, if not sometimes better than white players, if he'd used his history of fighting for equality and applying it to this important issue, what might have happened? Of course, there would have been huge resistance, just as there was when Jackie Robinson entered the game. But Landis had never feared that resistance in the past. He went up against the richest, most powerful man in the world, who no doubt could have found a way to eliminate Landis. Landis went up against foreign kings. He went up against the Chicago mob. And he was a smart guy. He could have found a way to break through the ice without losing his job, his image, and his public standing. And yes, it might have led to a disgruntled segment of the fan base. It might have led to violence. But he had the means, he had the intelligence, he had the clout to do something much earlier. And this is through the lens of my time and his time. This is a huge loss on so many levels. From a human rights level, imagine the lives changed. Hundreds, thousands of African American players breaking through years earlier. And then how their families' lives would have been affected. And all the millions of people of color watching, how they would have gained hope that more is possible. On a fan level, think of all that we lost. We could have seen some of the best ever facing the best of the majors in official games. Josh Gibson, nicknamed the Black Babe Ruth, Buck Leonard, Oscar Charlton, Martin Diego, and Satchel Paige, who did play in the majors and who was still impressive when he debuted at the age of 42. But this only begs the question, what records would have been broken? What amazing feats would have been recorded if he'd been signed in his prime? After this whole story, I don't know where I fall in terms of assigning praise and blame for Judge Kenesaw Mountain Landis, except to say he's often portrayed as a legend, a myth, but in the end, he is, in fact, very much human. And I keep coming back to the words of Governor J.B. Pritzker, because it feels like if there's any takeaway, it's this. With so much complexity, so much confusion in the world, maybe we can simplify things with this basic rule of thumb. The dumbest person in the room is often the cruelest, and the smartest is often the kindest. Living your life using this simple guide, would that be so bad? We'll end tonight with a listener baseball story from Anthony, a pastor who lives in New Jersey.
I got ordained in 2019. I've preached on Field of Dreams probably 3 or 4 times in the past 6 years. Probably every other year I'm doing a sermon on Field of Dreams because it's so good, and it speaks to me. My uncle was a clerk or a mailroom kind of guy on Wall Street, and occasionally brokers would give him tickets to Mets games, and he would pass them on to my dad sometimes, and Dad would take me. And so from the time that I was 6 or 7 years old, I was going to Mets games like once a year, twice a year kind of thing, and I just fell in love with the team. And as you know, those were horrible years. We would sit and watch games, and my dad would watch, and there was the beginnings of something there. And they won in '86, which for a young guy, I was 15 then, that was just tremendous. So then I passed that on to my son. It always is a source of pride for me when I go on Instagram or whatever, and he pops up, and it's always the Mets score, and he's always posting about how they're doing and stuff. And I'd like to think that my dad and I had a small part in instilling that in him. My dad died a little less than 2 years ago. That's such a powerful memory. I can always think back to those days, and the bonding experience of just me and him, driving to the ballpark. And Dad, he didn't smoke at the ballpark, obviously, but he would light up a cigar in the car, and we drive into Queens, and from Long Island we drive into Queens and go and watch the game. And it was fun, and it was very innocent, and I didn't know how good I had it. And I'm sorry that I'm crying during the first time that we're meeting. But when you're fortunate enough to have someone who you have a connection with, even a little bit, it means the world. And so, the thing for me is, now I'm a dad. I've got 4 kids, and I want to be better than my dad was, and possibly even instill a love of baseball to my kids. That would be an amazing thing, because at some point, God willing, there's going to be grandkids, and then hopefully that gets passed on. I think that there is a church of baseball. There's such a fulfilling aspect to baseball, and it's so rewarding. I think it gives a lot more than it takes, if you are willing to accept what it's giving. So if you love a team, you can enjoy the ups and downs, the ability to remove yourself from sort of some of the other harsh realities of your life, and just be focused on the story of the individual game or the season or whatever it might be. But there's a tremendous amount of redemption that occurs, and specifically, in Field of Dreams. Um, but I imagine that there's a lot of other people that find redemption in baseball along the way.
Thanks so much, Anthony, for sharing your story. Coming next, in honor of the 30-year anniversary coming up of Cal Ripken Jr.'s record-breaking consecutive game streak, I'm going to do a multi-part series on Cal Ripken Jr., Lou Gehrig, the streak, and the phenomenal stories within this story. And I hope you enjoy this as much as I enjoyed researching it. That's all for tonight. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Music by Sergi Patkin and Ashot Danielian at Pixabay. Good night.